close your eyes and imagine a world where silence was sacred, where knowledge was guarded like treasure, and where the rustle of a scroll was as precious as the song of a bird. Tonight, we step quietly into the life of an ancient librarian, not a grand scholar, not a famous philosopher, but one of the unseen caretakers who preserved the wisdom of civilizations. Their days were slow, careful, and filled with small rituals of ink, papyrus, and memory. Drift with me as we walk through the hidden corridors of a library long lost to time. The first light of dawn stretched across the horizon, painting the skies above Alexandria in soft shades of rose and gold. Along the harbor, ships with wide sails swayed gently, their masts cutting slender lines against the glowing sky. Some had arrived from Greece, others from Phoenicia, and still more from distant lands farther east. Each carried goods, treasures, and, most importantly to our librarian's world, scrolls and manuscripts. The librarian stirred awake in his modest quarters near the library grounds, the faint sound of seagulls breaking the silence of early morning. His chambers were simple, a low bed of woven reeds, a small clay oil lamp blackened with soot, and a single shelf where a few personal scrolls rested, gifts from teachers of his youth. He rubbed his eyes, listening to the world beyond his door. Alexandria was already waking. Merchants calling, carts rolling over stone streets, and the murmur of priests at nearby temples preparing their morning rites. Today, like every day, he would rise before most of the city, walking to the grand library before the sun fully climbed above the sea. His role was quiet but sacred. He was a keeper of words, a guardian of knowledge gathered from across the ancient world. His name may not have been remembered, yet his life was woven into the whispers of parchment and ink. He slipped on a plain linen tunic, tied at the waist with a rope of woven fiber. Sandals were strapped around his feet. With a brief moment of stillness, he adjusted his belt pouch, which carried wax tablets and a stylus, tools he always kept close. These were not for the public eye, but for personal notes, little thoughts that drifted into his mind as he worked among the scrolls. The walk to the library was brief but filled with wonder. The marble columns of the great complex shimmered faintly with dew. Carved sphinxes stood guard near the steps, their stone faces catching the first rays of light. Torches, still burning low from the night watch, flickered and hissed in the gentle sea breeze. The librarian's heart always beat a little faster as he approached the towering entrance. This was no ordinary building. It was said to hold hundreds of thousands of scrolls, perhaps the knowledge of the entire world. Works of poetry, philosophy, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and stories from lands far beyond Egypt's borders rested within. Every day here was a pilgrimage into wisdom. The doors opened with a creak, revealing a vast hall that smelled of papyrus, cedar wood, and faintly of smoke from oil lamps left burning through the night. Inside, rows upon rows of scrolls lay organized in wooden shelves that climbed high along the walls. Some shelves reached so tall that ladders were needed to reach their treasures. Scribes had already begun their work in quiet corners, copying, translating, and cataloging. The librarian paused at the threshold. Breathing deeply, here, the air itself felt heavy with memory. Every scroll was a voice, a whisper from someone long gone, carried into the present by ink and careful hands. His duty was not glorious, nor was it often recognized. Yet without men like him, the words would fade, the voices forgotten. His first task of the morning was to check the intake of new scrolls delivered overnight. Ships arriving at Alexandria's port were often inspected, and any written works they carried, whether Greek plays, Babylonian star charts, or Indian tales, were seized, copied, and stored. The originals were said to be kept, while copies were returned to their owners. This controversial practice had filled the library with a collection unmatched in the known world. He moved quietly across the marble floor, the soles of his sandals tapping lightly. In the intake chamber, a small pile of scrolls awaited, their leather cases still bearing the scent of sea salt. He gently untied one case, revealing the scroll inscribed in Greek. Carefully, he unrolled it partway, eyes scanning the text. It was a work on herbal remedies, filled with notes about plants that healed wounds and eased pain. He smiled faintly, imagining how many lives such knowledge could save. Each scroll carried its own story. Some were old and frayed, edges browned with age. Others were crisp and new, ink still sharp and dark. To him, they were not just words but living voices speaking across time. As he worked, he whispered softly to himself, reciting a few lines here and there, his voice mingling with the quiet scratching of quills around the room. After checking each scroll, he carefully recorded its arrival on his wax tablet, noting the language, author, and subject. Later, these notes would be transferred to more permanent cataloging records. He was not the only librarian. There were many who worked here, but he felt pride in his role. Even the smallest detail mattered, for a misplaced scroll could mean the loss of knowledge for generations. As the sun rose higher, light streamed through high windows, casting long golden beams across the hall. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, like tiny stars in the morning glow. The librarian straightened his back and allowed himself a moment of quiet wonder. Outside, Alexandria bustled with trade and politics, but here inside, time moved differently. The library was a temple of thought, and he was one of its quiet priests. And so his day began, not with noise or grandeur, but with silence, ink, and the careful touch of hands that honored the wisdom of ages past. The first light of dawn drifts gently through the high, narrow windows of the library's scriptorium. Dust motes hang in the golden air, turning slow circles above the polished wooden desks. The librarian steps softly across the stone floor, sandals whispering against the cool surface. The building is waking with him. He can hear the faint calls of birds outside, blending with the low murmur of the city as it stirs to life. Yet here, inside these walls, the world feels hushed, almost sacred. The scriptorium is where manuscripts are copied, one careful line at a time. It is both a place of labor and devotion. Each desk is set with parchment or papyrus, reed pens trimmed to sharp points, and small containers of ink, thick and black. Some desks hold brushes dipped in vibrant colors, waiting for the artists who illuminate the first letters with flourishes of gold and blue. Our librarian inhales the smell of the room, a mix of ink, old parchment, beeswax candles, and faint traces of leather from the bindings. This scent is familiar, a quiet comfort, reminding him that each day begins the same way, with order, care, and steady work. He walks past a row of young scribes already seated, their heads bowed, hands steady as they copy ancient texts. The sound of scratching reeds fills the air, a steady rhythm like rain pattering on stone. Some are novices, still learning to shape their letters evenly, Others are experienced, their handwriting flowing in neat, elegant lines. Each page they complete is a victory against time and decay, ensuring the knowledge written here will not vanish. At his desk, the librarian unrolls a fresh sheet of papyrus. The fibers are smooth, though faintly ridged from the reeds pressed together in its making. He sets a weight at one end so it won't curl, then dips his reed pen into the ink. Before the first word touches the page, he pauses. His lips move silently, reciting a prayer that the hand will not falter, that the mind will stay sharp, that the words will endure. The text before him is an old story from centuries past, copied so many times that some earlier pages show signs of wear, ink fading, corners frayed. His task is to bring it to life again, to trace every line faithfully so future generations may read it. The work demands patience. Each letter must be formed with care, with no smudge, no slip. A mistake is more than a blemish. It is a scar on wisdom itself. The librarian leans close, eyes steady, as his pen glides across the papyrus. The strokes feel like a kind of meditation, downward, across, a curve, another line. His breathing slows, his thoughts quiet, until all that remains is the motion of hand and ink. Occasionally, he sharpens the pen with a small knife, holding it at just the right angle. Sometimes he mixes a bit of water into the ink if it thickens. The tools are simple, yet the work feels monumental. With each mark, he is not just copying words, he is keeping memory alive. From time to time, he looks up and watches the scribes around him. A young apprentice pauses, frowning at a smudge, then carefully scrapes it away with a blade. Another dips a brush into a tiny pot of crushed lapis lazuli, painting the first letter of a new chapter in brilliant blue. Their dedication is quiet but fierce. They know they may never be known by name, but the manuscripts they copy will travel far, carried to scholars, rulers, and storytellers in lands they may never see. Hours pass like this. The sun rises higher, casting brighter light through the windows. Shadows shift across the desks. The silence of the scriptorium deepens, broken only by the occasional cough, the rustle of papyrus, the faint creak of wood. For the librarian, the work is both burden and blessing. His back grows stiff, his eyes strain in the light, but his heart is steady. Each word he copies ties him to those who came before and to those who will come after. He is part of a chain, centuries, unseen yet unbroken. As the morning lengthens, he sets aside one finished sheet and begins another. A pile of completed pages grows slowly beside him. They will later be sewn together, bound between wooden covers, and stored on the shelves. But for now, the work continues, one careful stroke after another, like ripples across still water. The scriptorium hums with this quiet labor until the midday bell rings. It is time to rest, to stretch weary limbs, and to step out into the world beyond the walls. Yet even as he rises, brushing ink dust from his fingers, the librarian feels the pull of the work behind him. The manuscripts wait. The words never sleep. The words never sleep. The morning sun is now high enough that its light spills through carved stone windows, painting long golden shapes across the marble floor. Within the library, the air is already warm, and the faint scent of drying papyrus grows sharper. The librarian, robes drawn close, moves quietly through the aisles of shelves. He does not walk with haste, for haste has no place in a sanctuary of knowledge. Instead, he moves as though in rhythm with the breath of the scrolls themselves, slow and measured. Here, the true work begins. He carries with him a bundle of clean cloths, brushes with soft bristles, and a small bowl of oil extracted from cedar wood. These are not weapons of war, nor tools of politics, but instruments of preservation. Each scroll is fragile, its fibers weakened by time, air, and careless hands. The librarian knows that his touch is not just physical, it is the last safeguard of memory, of stories and truths too delicate to survive without care. He pauses at a wooden shelf carved long ago, where the oldest texts are stored. Their edges are darkened, their colors faded, and yet they breathe still. He selects one carefully, as though greeting an old friend. The papyrus crinkles faintly as he lays it across the cleaning cloth. For a moment he simply looks at it, acknowledging its existence, as though giving silent thanks that it has endured another season. Then, with slow precision, he begins. The brush, dipped lightly in oil, moves in gentle strokes, teasing away dust that has gathered. Every movement is practiced, every gesture restrained, for too much pressure would erase what time has already made fragile. As he works, he hums under his breath, not a song for others to hear, but a rhythm to steady his hands. To him, these scrolls are alive, not alive as birds or men are, but alive in their essence. They hold voices of those who walked before. Scribes who once pressed reed pens to wet clay, scholars who copied letters by the glow of an oil lamp, poets who entrusted their hearts to lines of verse. Each scroll holds not only words but fragments of a soul. If one were lost, it would be as though a candle flame had been extinguished in the dark of eternity. His task is not glamorous. He will never be celebrated in marble, nor sung of in triumphal songs. But his labor ensures that the wisdom of the ancients will not slip into silence, and in this he takes quiet pride. The librarian straightens, setting the restored scroll back into its cradle. He lingers a moment, fingers tracing the wood, before selecting another. His eyes fall upon a text written in a language now seldom spoken. It is a philosophical treatise, its letters sharp and narrow, its words heavy with meaning. He remembers his mentor's voice explaining that, even if a language is no longer living, its ideas breathe on, waiting for new tongues to speak them again. He feels, at that moment, like a bridge between ages. Those who came before placed their knowledge into his hands. Those who come after will rely on him, though they may never know his name. His touch, his patience, his steady care, they all become invisible threads binding past to future. The midday sun glows brighter. Outside, the streets hum with the clamor of markets, animals, and distant sea winds. But here, within these walls, time is different. It does not rush, it does not clamor. It lingers like dust in sunlight, suspended between then and now. At times, while tending to the scrolls, the librarian imagines what it would be like if the writers of these works could walk into the library today. Would they recognize their own words? Would they marvel at how far their thoughts had traveled? Or would they be humbled, as he is, by how much effort it takes to keep a single line of writing safe across centuries? These questions hum softly in his mind, but he does not let them linger too long. His hands must not falter. He continues his quiet work until the stack beside him has been tended to, each scroll cleaned and returned to its home. When he finally pauses, his hands smell faintly of cedar oil, his robe dusted with the fine powder of ancient papyrus. He wipes his palms slowly, then looks around the room. The shelves stand taller, prouder, as though refreshed by his care. And deep in his chest, there is a calm warmth. He knows that though the world outside may roar with voices of kings and merchants, inside these walls, another kind of power rests quietly. The power of memory preserved, of wisdom protected, of stories waiting to be read. For now, his part is done. Tomorrow, the scrolls will breathe again, and so will he. The work of the librarian was not only to store the scrolls, but to give them order. Without order, the Grand Library would have been no more than a vast cavern filled with words no one could ever hope to find. It was the hand of the librarian that transformed chaos into structure, confusion into clarity, and so, after morning duties of dusting shelves and retrieving scrolls for scholars, the day turned to one of careful cataloging. The table where this work was done was worn smooth by countless elbows and hands that had leaned upon it. The surface bore faint stains of ink, and in the corners lay tiny grooves left by the sharp points of styluses. The librarian sat with a reed pen in hand, its tip dipped in soot-black ink mixed with gum. Beside him lay strips of papyrus that would become the small tags, the labels that granted each scroll its identity. Every scroll was unique. Some were wrapped in red ribbons, others tied with plain linen cords. Some bore signs of age, brittle edges, faint tears at the seams, while others looked as though they had only recently arrived from the copyist's bench. On each, the librarian would attach a small tag, noting the subject: medicine, poetry, history, astronomy, or philosophy. In this way, a seeker might move through the shelves and find precisely what they desired. To an outsider, such work might seem monotonous, yet to the librarian, it carried its own quiet thrill. With each label affixed, another piece of the world's knowledge was made accessible. It was not unlike placing stars into constellations, scattered points of light becoming patterns that told stories in the sky. The catalogue itself was a creation of patience. A long papyrus roll unfurled across the table, upon which the librarian would record the location of each scroll, its title, and sometimes its author. This catalogue was the map to the library's universe. Without it, the shelves would descend into labyrinthine confusion. With it, the library became navigable, a city of knowledge where every street was marked and every house could be found. The air carried a mix of scents: the sweet dryness of papyrus, the faint tang of ink, and the musky presence of leather ties. As the reed pen scratched softly across the papyrus, the room seemed to hold its breath, as though respecting the delicate labor of order-making. Occasionally, a scholar would enter, seeking assistance. The librarian would pause, dip his head respectfully, and guide them to the correct shelf. Then he would return, unrolling the great catalogue once more. In such tasks, time moved differently. Hours slipped by unnoticed, marked only by the shifting of sunlight across the tiled floor. What might have been tedious to another soul was, to the librarian, a source of calm. To catalogue was to weave order from chaos, to impose a gentle structure on the overwhelming flood of human thought. In those quiet hours, he did not simply handle scrolls. He shepherded centuries of wisdom into a living order. There were challenges, of course. Sometimes scrolls arrived without authors' names, their contents mysterious. The librarian would carefully skim them, deciphering hints. Was it a treatise on medicine, or perhaps a collection of poetry? He would add them cautiously to the catalogue, knowing that every misstep could lead to confusion. In other cases, two works might share similar titles, and the librarian was forced to add distinctions, subtle marks that told them apart. It was a labor of both the mind and the spirit. What lingered most, though, was the sense of responsibility. To catalogue the scrolls was to ensure that no wisdom was lost in a sea of parchment. Every tag, every notation was a small promise that when someone came seeking, they would find. It was an act of service, not to one person, but to countless generations yet to come. As the afternoon wore on, the library filled with a low murmur. Scholars debated softly at tables, copyists sharpened their reeds, and messengers passed through with deliveries. Yet, at the cataloguing desk, there was serenity. The librarian bent over his work, ink-stained fingers gliding across papyrus, the catalogue slowly unfurling into something grander than itself. With each entry, the great library became less a collection of scrolls and more a woven tapestry of ordered thought. By the time the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the walls, another section of the catalogue had been completed. The librarian rolled it carefully, placed it in its protective case, and tied it with cord. A new order had been established, a new thread added to the fabric of human memory. The task was endless, but so too was the meaning it carried. The library was never silent for long. Though its walls seemed to hold their breath in the cool mornings, by midday the air stirred with voices, questions, and the rustle of visitors' robes. Scholars, travelers, and emissaries from distant lands arrived at its gates, each bringing with them fragments of knowledge and seeking something more in return. Our librarian welcomed them with practiced calm. His duty was not only to guard the scrolls, but to guide the seekers who came through the towering doors. Some approached with reverence, bowing before shelves as if before altars. Others arrived hurriedly, eyes bright with questions, eager to find answers hidden in the ink of past centuries. He watched their steps carefully. Too often, visitors treated the scrolls as though they were mere tools, forgetting the countless hands and lives that had carried them across deserts, rivers, and seas. To the librarian, each scroll bore a soul, fragile, enduring, and deserving of care. When he placed a roll of papyrus in a scholar's hands, he was entrusting them with a lineage older than either of them. The visitors came in waves. In the early afternoon, a group of young students arrived from Athens. Their Greek accents were light, their sandals dusty from travel. They bowed deeply before the librarian, explaining that they wished to study the works of Herodotus and Thales, philosophers whose words had shaped their teachers' lessons. The librarian smiled gently, leading them to a section where carefully copied manuscripts rested in neat bundles. He watched as their eyes widened, fingers trembling to touch words that once lived centuries before. Later, an emissary from Persia entered, robed in fine silk that caught the sunlight like rippling water. His presence brought whispers among the students, for such men traveled rarely without purpose. He spoke of seeking astronomical texts, maps of the heavens traced by Babylonian priests, records of eclipses, predictions of seasons. The librarian understood at once. Such knowledge was more than curiosity. It was power, guiding the sowing of crops, the timing of journeys, the fate of kings. He escorted the man to a secure alcove, where ancient clay tablets had been carefully stored. Each visitor asked differently, but each revealed something of themselves in their search. One requested stories of heroes, another the diagrams of physicians, another the verses of poets long forgotten in their homeland. Some wanted truths of the natural world, others longed for wisdom of the soul. The library was both temple and market for these desires, and the librarian was its quiet steward. He noticed, too, how the visitors treated the scrolls once they were given. Some held them with gentle reverence, as though they might shatter at a breath. Others unrolled them too quickly, the papyrus straining against their hands. With patience, the librarian showed them the proper way to cradle the roll, to unwind it slowly, to rest it upon smooth wooden stands so that it would not crease. These were lessons not written in any book, but passed down through generations of caretakers like himself. As the day deepened, a hush often fell among the tables where scholars bent over their work. The scratching of reed pens filled the air, steady and meditative. Some copied entire passages, line by line, so that knowledge could be carried home. Others wrote only notes, ideas sparked by what they read. In those quiet hours, the librarian often paused to take in the scene before him. Minds across cultures, united not by borders or politics, but by the hunger to learn. Yet he also knew the fragility of it all. The scrolls were vulnerable to fire, to moisture, to the careless hand of man. He feared sometimes that a single misstep, a single spark, could undo centuries of labor. Watching the visitors, he carried both pride and unease, balancing the joy of sharing with the responsibility of guarding. The day wore on. Some visitors departed with smiles, offering thanks and blessings. Others left frustrated, unable to find what they sought. The librarian accepted both with the same calm, knowing that not every answer lay within these walls, and that knowledge itself was often a lifelong pursuit. When the last scholar of the afternoon closed his scroll and rose to leave, the librarian felt both relief and weariness. The library had absorbed the voices of the day, and now it sank again into stillness. The scent of papyrus lingered in the air, mingled with faint traces of ink and candle smoke. He gathered the scrolls, one by one, returning them to their rightful places, each carefully aligned with its companions. The sun dipped lower, its light softening as it slipped through high windows. Shadows stretched along the floor, brushing against the shelves. Once again, the librarian was alone with the scrolls, and in that solitude, he found quiet satisfaction. He had guided the seekers, preserved the knowledge, and honored the silent lives of the words entrusted to his care. For though the scholars came and went, the scrolls remained, and the librarian, humble guardian of countless voices, kept watch day after day, life after life. As the evening sun lowered behind the city walls, the library grew quieter. The loud voices of students, the quick questions of scribes, and the firm requests of priests faded into soft murmurs. It was in these calmer hours that the librarian often found the most unusual tasks arriving at his table. Tonight was no exception. A messenger entered the hall with a guarded urgency. His tunic bore the emblem of a healer's guild, and in his hands was a sealed scroll, its clay seal marked with the symbol of a serpent coiled around a staff. He bowed slightly before the librarian and placed the scroll on the desk. "This," he said with care, "is a copy of an older healing text. Our master physicians request it be checked for they fear errors may have crept into its last transcription. The librarian understood the weight of such a request. Errors in healing texts were not simple mistakes. A single miswritten measure of a herb, a single confused diagram of a bone or organ, could mean suffering or death for those treated. He accepted the scroll with reverence, knowing he must examine it against the older copies stored deep in the collection. The work of comparison, he unrolled the scroll slowly, the parchment stretching across the polished cedar table. Symbols filled the surface in neat rows, accompanied by small sketches of herbs, tools, and the outlines of human anatomy. His trained eye noticed subtle differences in ink thickness, in the slant of certain letters, and in the shape of the tiny drawings. Taking a lamp closer, he began the long process of comparison. The library possessed a copy of the same text from a century before, preserved in a protective chest. That older scroll, though faded, was considered reliable and sacred by healers. He set them side by side. The scent of old ink and leather filled his nostrils as his eyes moved line by line. He mouthed the words quietly, repeating herbs' names and dosage amounts. Sometimes his lips paused, sometimes he frowned. At least twice, he caught a difference. A line that should have instructed the healer to mix 2 parts honey with 1 part vinegar had instead been transcribed as 2 parts vinegar with 1 part honey. The proportions were inverted. He marked the margin carefully with a faint note, his reed pen scratching softly. He continued on, catching a second error in a description of a root used to calm fevers. The new scroll had listed it as soaked in cold water when the original had clearly demanded boiled in warm water. Small differences to the casual reader, but potentially deadly in practice. His shoulders stiffened with the knowledge that lives could rest on his corrections. The roll of trust when the comparison was done, he rolled the corrected version back up and sealed it with fresh clay. He inscribed his own mark upon it, declaring it fit and safe to be returned to the physicians. The messenger, waiting patiently, accepted it with a deep bow of gratitude. Moments like this reminded the librarian of his silent role in the survival of knowledge. He was not the one who healed the sick, nor the one who led rituals, nor the one who taught crowds of eager students. Yet without his steady hands and sharp eyes, knowledge itself could fray, weaken, and crumble. A mistaken word could bring harm. An omitted line could erase wisdom. The trust placed in him was invisible but immense. He thought of all the scrolls he had handled: astronomy, law, trade, poetry, healing, philosopher, and realized that each bore invisible threads connecting generations. His task was not only to preserve the scrolls, but to protect the accuracy of memory itself. Evening reflections as the lamps were lit and shadows stretched across the marble floor. The librarian set aside his pen. He leaned back slightly, the stiffness of the day pressing into his spine, and allowed himself a rare moment of quiet reflection. The library around him glowed in the dim lamplight. Scrolls lined the walls like silent witnesses to human endeavor. He thought about the physicians who would soon use the corrected text to treat the sick, perhaps saving a child from fever or soothing the pain of a wounded soldier. He was never there to see such outcomes, but he imagined them: a healed patient breathing easier, a grateful family lighting a small lamp in thanks, a healer confident in their knowledge because a librarian had quietly ensured the scroll was true. Such was his reward, not fame, not wealth, but the steady knowledge that his life's work upheld the chain of learning that bound the past to the present. When at last he extinguished his lamp and stepped out into the cooling night, the stars stretched wide above him. He looked up, as countless scholars and dreamers had done, and whispered a simple thought. As the stars keep their courses. With that, he walked home, the weight of responsibility balanced by the quiet dignity of a task faithfully done. The sun slanted lower in the sky, casting a warm amber glow across the marble walls of the great library. The air within the halls grew cooler as the day progressed, yet the atmosphere remained alive with the murmur of scholars, the scratching of styluses, and the faint shuffle of sandals across smooth stone floors. For the librarian, this was a cherished hour, when the library transformed from a workplace into a living forum, a place of dialogue and exchange. It was no longer just about storing knowledge, but about gathering it, weaving new strands into the ever-growing fabric of human understanding. As he returned from storing a recently translated scroll, he noticed a group of students gathered in a semicircle around a visiting philosopher. Their voices rose and fell like waves, debating questions about the nature of truth, the movement of stars, and the meaning of virtue. Some gestured excitedly, while others sat quietly, eyes intent, absorbing each word as if it were a treasure. The librarian slowed his pace, choosing to linger on the fringes. His work gave him the privilege of being both participant and observer in the intellectual life of the city. The philosopher, a wiry man with a thick beard, spoke with great passion. Knowledge does not belong to one man, nor to one city, he declared. It is like fire, spreading from one torch to another. The more it is shared, the brighter it becomes. The students nodded in agreement, and the librarian felt a flicker of pride. It was here, in these halls, that the sparks of wisdom found fuel and flame. His role, though quiet, was vital. Without the careful preservation of scrolls, without the daily toil of organizing, copying, and protecting them, such discussions could not flourish. Later, in another corner of the library, a scribe from Egypt unfurled a papyrus containing astronomical charts. He laid it side by side with a parchment from Greece, each covered in intricate diagrams of celestial spheres. A mathematician joined him, leaning close, and together they debated the differences. The librarian, drawn in by their enthusiasm, assisted by fetching a Babylonian tablet that described the motions of planets in precise cuneiform signs. The men bent over the ancient clay, comparing notes, their words a blend of Greek, Egyptian, and local dialects. Though the languages differed, the pursuit of understanding was universal. In moments like these, the library became not just a storehouse, but a crossroads of civilizations. In the great reading hall, others gathered for quieter pursuits. A poet sat cross-legged on a cushion, reciting lines to a friend, seeking feedback on the rhythm of his verse. Two young women, students of medicine, studied anatomical scrolls, tracing the outlines of organs with their fingers as they memorized names and functions. A historian carefully compiled notes from earlier records, his stylus tapping gently against the wax surface of his tablet. Everywhere the librarian looked, knowledge was alive, reshaping itself through human voices and hands. As he walked among them, some nodded in greeting, Others beckoned for assistance. A student asked for guidance in locating a particular scroll on navigation, one that described the stars sailors used to chart their voyages. The librarian led him through the shelves, speaking softly of the cataloging system, pointing out the subtle markings that distinguished one collection from another. He explained how scrolls were grouped not only by subject, but also by origin, for often the same subject was approached differently by different cultures. The student listened with eagerness, his eyes widening as he realized that the wisdom of the seas was not confined to one people, but spread across many shores. The librarian's duties were not only practical, but also philosophical. He often found himself reflecting on the meaning of this work. What was the purpose of gathering so much knowledge? Was it to glorify the rulers who funded the library, ensuring their names lived on as patrons of wisdom? Was it to equip the state with advantages in trade, navigation, and war? Or was it, more simply, to nourish the human spirit, to give voice to questions that had no easy answers? He suspected the truth was a mixture of all these, but he believed most firmly in the last. Without curiosity, without the hunger to know and to share, what would become of people? They would stagnate, blind to the vastness of the world. Toward evening, the library hosted a more formal gathering. Scholars assembled in the central atrium, seated on benches arranged in circles. Oil lamps flickered to life, casting steady light upon their faces. A moderator called for order, and the debates began. Today's subject was a topic of great interest: whether the stars influenced human destiny. Some argued with fervor that celestial bodies dictated the fates of men, their births and deaths inscribed in the heavens. Others countered that stars were but distant fires, indifferent to earthly affairs. The debate grew heated, yet respectful, and the librarian watched with quiet admiration. He had seen many such discussions, and though no single answer was ever reached, each left the participants richer in thought. During a pause, one scholar rose and acknowledged the librarian. "We stand upon the shoulders of those who preserve our words," he said, gesturing toward him. A murmur of agreement swept through the room. The librarian felt a warmth spread in his chest. It was rare to be spoken of directly, for most of his contributions were unseen, tucked between the folds of daily routine. Yet at that moment, he understood that his work was not invisible. It was the foundation upon which these conversations rested. As the gathering continued, he retreated to the edge of the hall, content to listen. The words flowed like a river, carrying with them the ideas of countless generations. He thought of the scrolls he had copied, the tablets he had stored, the parchments he had carefully repaired. Each had a voice, and together they formed a chorus. He was not merely a guardian of this chorus, he was part of it. The night deepened, and as he extinguished the lamps one by one, the voices of the scholars echoed in his mind. The library was quiet again, its shelves heavy with silence, yet that silence was alive, waiting for dawn to bring it back to life. For knowledge was never truly still. It was always gathering, flowing, and renewing itself as long as there were those who sought it. The sun was climbing high when the librarian turned his attention to one of the most delicate tasks of his profession: the preservation of aging manuscripts. In the cool recesses of the storage chamber, shelves stretched in endless rows, stacked with papyrus rolls and wax tablets. Some were new, crisp, and sharp with ink, their fibers still fresh and pliant. Others, however, had grown brittle with age, their edges flaking into dust at the slightest touch. It was in these fragile pieces that the true burden of preservation lay. The librarian approached with reverence, carrying a soft brush made of reeds. He began his work slowly, clearing specks of dust and dirt from the surface of a manuscript that might have been centuries old. Each stroke was careful, measured, as though brushing away grains of sand from a treasure buried in the earth. He knew that a moment's haste could cause irreparable damage. The papyrus scroll in front of him contained a copy of a medical treatise written long before his own lifetime. Its ink had faded into a deep brown, and its fibers had grown weak with time. To lose such a work would mean not only the destruction of a physical object, but the erasure of knowledge, a voice from the past silenced forever. His fingers lingered on the text, feeling its ridges, almost hearing the voice of the scribe who once pressed ink into its surface. Once the dust was cleared, the librarian began reinforcing the roll. He moistened a thin adhesive paste made from flour and water, applying it with precision to the cracks and tears in the papyrus. Then he pressed small slips of newer papyrus onto the weakened areas, patching them carefully like a tailor mending an ancient garment. The work required immense patience, and sometimes hours would pass before even a single scroll could be strengthened. Yet to him, it was not mere labor, it was a sacred act. While he worked, he thought of the countless scrolls housed in these walls, each one a fragile thread in the vast tapestry of human knowledge. Philosophy, astronomy, law, mathematics, poetry, medicine, disciplines that shaped the minds and hands of nations, all rested here, their survival balanced on his diligence. To neglect them would mean allowing wisdom itself to crumble into dust. At times the librarian felt the weight of this responsibility pressing heavily upon him. After all, fire, flood, war, or mere decay could wipe away centuries of learning in a single stroke. He had heard of libraries elsewhere that had perished, collections consumed by flames or lost to conquest. Even the greatest of works could not outlast neglect or disaster. His role, humble though it seemed, was in truth a defense against forgetting. The preservation chamber smelled faintly of paste, papyrus, and old ink. Light streamed gently through a narrow window above, casting stripes across the rows of scrolls. He paused to admire the interplay of shadow and parchment, realizing how fleeting it all was. Someday, even his repairs might fail, but his efforts would grant these works a little more time, perhaps centuries more, perhaps enough for new generations to copy and carry them forward. Occasionally, apprentices would join him in these efforts, though few had the patience for such delicate tasks. Today, he worked alone. He whispered softly as he worked, almost like a prayer, not to any god in particular, but to the memory of the writers, the scholars, and the voices preserved in these fragile rolls. Each patch, each stitch of papyrus was a gesture of gratitude. As the hours passed, the librarian finished his repairs and gently rolled the scroll, binding it with a strip of linen. He placed it back into its niche, where it joined countless others, one voice among many, each waiting to be remembered. Before leaving, he wrote a small note in the catalogue, the date, the repairs made, and the condition of the scroll. The catalogue itself was as vital as the scrolls. Without it, these works would vanish into chaos, lost in the maze of shelves. His neat handwriting ensured that whoever came after him would know the state of his treasure and perhaps one day continue the work of preservation. When he finally stepped out of the chamber, the air outside felt warmer, brighter, freer. But he carried within him the deep satisfaction of having given another fragment of human thought a chance to endure. In that quiet, uncelebrated task lay the very soul of his profession. Not glory, not fame, but guardianship over memory itself. The sun drifted lower in the western sky, its fading light painting the stone walls of the library with long amber streaks. The once bustling corridors were growing quieter. The students had departed, their clay tablets and scrolls safely stored in the alcoves. The royal scribes had gathered their documents and returned to their quarters. Now, only a handful of librarians remained, moving deliberately through the vast space, ensuring that the day's work was properly concluded. I set aside the last of the scrolls I had been reviewing and leaned back against the wooden bench. My body ached from hours of careful posture, but there was satisfaction in knowing that today's records were secure. Across the hall, my colleague carried a basket of reed brushes to be cleaned, while another gently smoothed the cracked edges of an old papyrus with a mixture of oil and resin. The air smelled faintly of ink, clay dust, and smoke from the oil lamps beginning to glow in the corners. The library, by evening, transformed into something different than in the day. In the morning, it was filled with chatter, footsteps, and constant requests. By nightfall, silence spread like a blanket. It became less a workplace and more a sanctuary. Walking slowly between the towering shelves, I felt the stillness press in. Each shelf held not only knowledge but voices, the echo of countless hands that had labored before me, scribes, scholars, kings, and nameless workers. Their breath lingered in the fibers of papyrus, in the baked grooves of tablets. Tonight, I had a task both solemn and ceremonial. The High Librarian had entrusted me with placing a newly finished manuscript into the restricted chamber known as the Hall of Memory. Few were permitted to enter there. It was a place where the most precious and dangerous works were kept. Treaties between kings, formulas for medicines, hymns to forgotten gods, and fragments of older libraries long since destroyed. The room was said to be as close to eternity as a mortal could reach. To place a scroll inside was to ensure it survived generations beyond one's own. I carried the manuscript with reverence, both hands supporting its polished wooden case. The scroll within contained an annotated list of celestial movements compiled over decades by royal astronomers. They had measured the stars with astounding precision, linking their cycles to floods, harvests, and omens. The document was considered too valuable to leave in the open archives. It had to be protected, locked in darkness, guarded by stone and ritual. The entrance to the Hall of Memory lay at the far end of the library, down a narrow passage lit by a single lamp. A heavy bronze door stood there, carved with protective symbols and watched over by 2 sentinels. They recognized me and the seal of the head librarian. After bowing slightly, they swung open the door, the hinges groaned, and a cool breath of air met me, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of parchment, cedar, and ancient dust. Inside, the chamber was hushed, lit only by a few steady lamps. The shelves here were not made of reed or simple wood, but reinforced with stone frames, designed to withstand fire and decay. Each row was meticulously labeled, the scrolls wrapped in linen or stored in carved boxes. Some bore inscriptions of foreign tongues, Fragments from Egypt, Babylon, or even distant India. To walk these aisles was to walk the bones of the world's memory. I moved carefully past shelves where the knowledge of forgotten dynasties slept. Finally, I reached the section for astronomical texts. With slow hands, I slid the new manuscript into its place, between a Babylonian star tablet and a collection of Greek fragments. For a moment, I lingered, pressing my palm against the shelf. A silent vow formed in my chest, that as long as we lived, this knowledge would endure. No fire, no war. No flood should erase it. When I turned back, I saw the other librarians had also gathered in the Hall of Memory. Each of us carried a candle. Together, we walked to the central dais, where an older scroll rested on a pedestal. It was a copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of a king who sought immortality and found instead the endurance of words. Once each week, it was our ritual to recite a portion of it in the chamber, not for an audience, but for the library itself, as if reminding the walls why they existed. Tonight was my turn. Unrolling the scroll, I read in a low, steady voice, letting the syllables echo against the stone. Look upon it still today, the ramparted wall of Uruk. Touch the threshold, ancient is its fashion. The others closed their eyes, their candles flickering like stars. For those brief minutes, we were no longer mere keepers of records. We were custodians of memory itself, part of a chain stretching backward into the dim past and forward into futures unseen. When the passage was finished, we returned the scroll to its resting place. The ritual complete, we filed out, each librarian blowing out their candle at the threshold. The Hall of Memory sank once more into darkness, its secrets sealed. The bronze door shut with a resounding finality, as though the knowledge within had been swallowed by the earth. Back in the main hall, the night deepened. The oil lamps flickered more brightly now, casting long shadows across the marble floors. A few of us lingered, tidying the last of the day's work. My colleague asked if I would join the others for supper, but I declined. Instead, I sat quietly on a bench, gazing at the rows of shelves, listening to the faint rustle of parchment, as if the library itself breathed in its sleep. In moments like these, I felt the paradox of my life. To the world outside, I was a simple functionary, a servant in the king's vast machinery, little more than a record keeper. But here, in this quiet temple of knowledge, I was part of something vast, something enduring. The clay tablets, the papyrus scrolls, the carved inscriptions, they were not only words, but fragments of human thought, sparks of light carried across centuries. Without us, they would crumble, vanish, be lost to silence. With us, they might endure long enough for others yet unborn to find them, to read them, and to know that we had lived. When at last I rose to leave, the lamps flickered low. Signaling the hour of rest, I stepped outside into the cool evening air. The city lay hushed beyond the walls, its streets glowing faintly with lantern light. Above, the stars began to appear, pinpricks of silver across the endless sky. I paused on the library steps, gazing upward. The astronomers, whose scroll I had just stored, would have known these constellations well. Their patterns had guided kings and farmers alike, and now they guided me home. The evening sky draped the city in a soft violet haze, as if the heavens themselves were winding down after a long day. From the upper terrace of the library, I gazed across the harbour, where the last ships of the day creaked against the wharf. The sea shimmered faintly, each wave carrying the glint of a fading sun. The air was warm but cooler now, touched with the fragrance of resin torches being lit along the streets. The library, vast and towering behind me, felt quieter than ever. By this hour, the corridors emptied, and the scroll rooms rested in near silence, like a grand orchestra pausing between movements. I lingered here, breathing in the stillness, aware that this was the part of the day I cherished most, when all the clamor of copying, sorting and instructing gave way to quiet reflection. I thought of the countless lives captured within these walls. Histories of kings and warriors, poems of love, loss and yearning, calculations of stars and planets measured with astounding precision by minds long gone, all of them preserved in fragile rolls of papyrus, waiting for a hand to unroll them and bring their voices back to life. It was humbling to realize that my own role, so small and uncelebrated, was to keep those voices safe. My name would never appear in the records, no grand statue would honor me, and yet my daily labors stitched together the fragile threads of memory across generations. The sound of footsteps broke my meditation. A younger scribe approached, his expression uncertain. "Master," he said softly, though I was no master in rank, only in years. "Some of the oil lamps have burned low in the eastern hall. Should I fetch more?" "Yes," I replied with a nod. "We must not let darkness touch the shelves. Even a moment of carelessness could undo centuries." He bowed and departed, leaving me alone again. How many times had I said those words? Constant enemy, as were insects, damp air, or neglect. We lived in vigilance for the sake of wisdom. I returned inside, walking the long corridors one last time. The mosaic floors gleamed faintly under torchlight, and the painted walls told their silent stories. Heroes of Homer, gods of Olympus, scholars of old. I paused in one chamber where the oldest scrolls were kept. Here, silence was thick, almost sacred. I ran my hand lightly across a sealed chest, aware of the treasure within. Ancient writings from lands beyond imagining. Some said even older than our city itself. As I stood there, I felt an odd sensation. Not fear nor sadness, but a strange kind of certainty that no matter what befell us, fires, wars, the turning of empires, these words would never truly vanish. Perhaps the papyrus would crumble, perhaps the ink would fade, but the ideas had already taken root in human minds. Once spoken, a word never dies. It echoes, shifting, reshaping, but always alive. Later, as I climbed the steps to my own small chamber, the library behind me hummed with the faint crackle of oil lamps. I lay upon my simple cot, the sounds of the city drifting in through the open shutters, the splash of oars, the laughter of late-night revelers, the distant cry of a gull. And I dreamed, not of battles or riches, but of quiet halls filled with words. I dreamed of children yet unborn, unrolling a scroll and discovering something written long ago. Perhaps one day, a boy or girl would read a line I had copied with my own weary hands, and for a brief moment, I would be remembered, not by name, but through the ink itself. In that thought, I found peace. The work was endless, the recognition invisible, but the legacy eternal. We were guardians of memory, keepers of flame, servants to knowledge itself. And though history might forget us, it would never forget us. It would never forget the words we carried forward. The library exhaled around me, vast and timeless. I closed my eyes, and in the darkness I heard it breathing still.